Hey everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our live virtual event with Tina Ontiveros, author of the new memoir, Rough House. I'm Lane Jacobson, the owner of Paulina Springs Books in Sisters, Oregon. Before we really get into things, just a few housekeeping and tech reminders. This event is being recorded, and after the event concludes, you can view the recording by going to booksincommonnw.com or visiting the Books in Common Northwest YouTube channel. There is a link to buy your copy of the book in the chat, and we'll be posting that back in the chat throughout the event. If you have any questions for the author, just click the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and we'll get to them as time allows. You can also see the questions other folks have asked and even vote on which questions you'd most like to hear the answer to. And you can leave comments in the chat window to the right. If you run into any tech issues along the way, we recommend you first try just exiting and then re-entering the webinar. If you can't get back in, you can visit the Books in Common Northwest YouTube channel where the event is being streamed live right now. And for any audio issues, we recommend just plugging in some headphones. That usually does the trick. And we would also like to remind everyone that this is a shared creative space, and we ask that everyone present be respectful of everybody else who's present. Offensive comments and or questions will see the user dismissed from this event. And a reminder also that this event is part of a series called Books in Common Northwest. We're going to be winding this down somewhere in November, early December as we head into the holidays. But until then, we have a ton of really, really great events set up for y'all over the next couple of weeks. Tomorrow at 4 p.m., Kirk is presenting a new middle grade novel, The Tiny Mansion. We've got events coming up with Kate McDermott, the author of Art of Pie, for her new book, Pie Camp. We've got an event with John Grisham, a new event with Jess Walter, author of Beautiful Ruins, for his new book, The Cold Millions. And that's just a few of the many events that we have. So please do go to booksincommonnw.com and check out the event calendar. And tonight, you'll also see some other faces on the screen with me. We are joined tonight by James Crossley, the manager of Madison Books in Seattle, and Ariana Palio-Vegas, the owner of Country Bookshelf in Bozeman, Montana. And we are the folks behind this whole event series, the Books in Common Northwest event series. And we also serve on the board of the Pacific Northwest Booksellers Association alongside our author tonight, Tina Ontiveros. Tina is a writer, a teacher, and bookseller based in Oregon. She was raised below the federal poverty line, living mostly with her single mother at the edge of the Oregon desert, but often with her constantly migrating dad in small timber towns around the Pacific Northwest. She's the first person in her family to go to college, and she completed her college education while raising her children. As a writer and a teacher, her work explores class, generational hardship, and the social constructs that marginalize the poor. And without further ado, I'm going to pass it off to Tina to introduce us to her memoir.
Thank you, Lane. And thank you, Ariana and James. I'm so happy to be here with you guys tonight. So my memoir, my book is called Rough House. And I never really am asked how to describe it, to be honest with you guys, but I think I would describe it on two different levels. At the local level, it's basically the story of me and my dad, Lloyd. Lloyd was a migrating logger. So when I was a little kid, we moved all around the Pacific Northwest, and my family of four lived in this 15-foot camp trailer, which was kind of a small space for four people. And it was sort of an exciting and adventurous life. My dad was very fun. He was very creative, and he had a lot of unconditional and joyful love for his two children, my brother Jesse and I. But he was also a child of generational poverty, and he was an addict. And so it was not sustainable. It was a difficult family dynamic. And eventually my mom left him. And for the rest of my upbringing, I sort of went back and forth between the two. And my dad was kind of constantly in this cycle of like trying to get sober and then falling off the wagon. And whenever he was sober, he would go to AA and he would go to the Kingdom Hall. So we were going to a lot of meetings when he was sober. We would We would go with him to AA, and we would go with him to the meetings of the Jehovah's Witnesses. So the book's just about not just the pain of poverty and addiction, but also the joy and the creativity and the beauty that came with all of that. On a more global level, I think for me, it's about the fact that it's like the idea that not all people have the same opportunities. And I think it's just really important to me to try to tell that story, to realize that it's really frustrating when you can't realize your potential. And there are people who just do not have the freedom to do that. And so for me, that was an important part of writing the book.
Did you have a section that you wanted to read from?
Sure. I do, Lane. No.
All right.
Let's see here. I think I'm just going to read 2 very small sections from the beginning. The first, just because I guess it gives you an idea of what the book's about. So, and they're both from the first chapter. And I don't think there's any setup you need to know. They're kind of from the setup section of the book, except to maybe know that we lived in this 15-foot trailer for a long time. And then there was a point at which my mom insisted that my dad get us a bigger trailer. It was a 35-footer, and she called it the mansion. So, okay. So the first one is about our first trailer. I was born on the move just like my dad. We were lumber nomads, native to nowhere. Lloyd was born in Klamath Falls, where Grandpa Herb worked at a sawmill for a while. When it came time for me to join my family, we were set up in headquarters, but it could just as easily have been another timber town. Headquarters isn't even officially a town. It's unincorporated, a company town at the end of the Camas Prairie Railroad, but it used to bustle with timber families, used by logging outfits as a place to set up camp while they harvested in the area. Today, the Pacific Northwest logging industry is a ghost of what it once was, and the same can be said for headquarters. I imagine our trailer in headquarters, the hitch sitting up on blocks in a circle of dry reddish dirt. I can see other trailers nearby, and towering over them all, a forest of Douglas fir, western hemlock, and western red cedar. Standing in this clearing, this grove of trailers, I smell those evergreens warming in the sun as they watch over the flow of migrating families. I smell extinguished campfires and hear the faraway whine of chainsaws, the constant chatter of birds, and insects clicking their songs. If it's daytime, I hear the rhythmic work of a woodpecker searching for food. At night, I hear frogs, crickets, and faint evidence of running water. I might see a few permanent structures in the camp, a laundry or an office maybe. Sloan, a lean German Shepherd mix, is tied to the front hitch of our trailer. He has created a patch of worn earth packed down by his paws as he runs back and forth on his lead. That dog will inspire my first sentence. Shut up, Sloan. A fact that so tickles Lloyd, he'll often entice the dog to bark just to hear my toddler voice repeat it. Lloyd made Sloan's lead from a repurposed length of yellow nylon winch strap. Lloyd always talked about Sloan like he was the best dog a man could want. Said he was gentle with us kids, but also a fierce and protective scrapper. He'd fight for us if he needed to. Mom remembered Sloan different. To her, he was another life to care for, another expense we couldn't afford, a constant source of guilt, always chained up, cowering under the trailer in thunderstorms or when fireworks or guns went off. A couple of lawn chairs with frames of metal tubing sit outside the door of the trailer. Their seats sunk from constant use, their backs woven of wide plastic bands in white and green. They have avocado platform armrests and surround the fire pit. This is my first home, the first of many. Wood paneling covers the inside walls and cabinets. A child can see the world in wood paneling. She can find shapes in the fabricated knots and lines to represent all the things she might never actually see. The kitchen has orange countertops with aluminum edges, yellow linoleum with an orange and brown pattern to simulate tile, meets the small patches of dark brown carpet in the sleeping and living areas at either end. The table, pushing up out of the floor like a square mushroom, folds flat to make the bed my brother and I share at night. At first, Mom puts me in a car bed and Jesse lies next to it until I'm old enough to snuggle in beside him. During the day, our bed becomes the table again and holds a heavy glass ashtray filled with cigarette butts. As a toddler, I sometimes climb on the bench seat and lean across the table to smell the ashtray. The table edge digs between my tiny ribs. My elbows crunch as I force my weight on them, straining toward what has been placed out of my reach. I extend my legs and stretch to put my nose at the lip of the amber-colored glass and gently sniff, the smell a concentrated comfort until I'm old enough to be ashamed of it. Yellow cotton blankets are folded to line the bench seats. I like to run their satin edging between my thumb and forefinger to pick off the little fiber pills that spatter their surfaces. On the counter is my mom's coffee cup, a brownish gold ceramic that's somehow metallic. A pattern of raised bumps, like an army of uniform warts, marches around its center. I like to run the pads of my fingers over them and pretend that they're telling me something in code. Later, after we left Lloyd and I started school far away from him, I would think of my dad in this set of coffee cups when I learned about Helen Keller and the magic way she learned to read with her fingertips. We lived in so many small mill towns my first 5 years: Randall, Packwood, Morton, CQ, and more. We lived in trailers, cabins, one-room studios, more trailers. Mom finally convinced Lloyd to settle down in Clallam Bay, Washington before Jesse started first grade. Crown Zellerback was the second largest lumber company shaving the surface of the Pacific Northwest back then. And Lloyd was lucky enough to get on their payroll. He was proud to be a company man, though it wouldn't last. For many years, I'd feel that pride too, whenever I saw a white metal Crown Zellerback paper towel dispenser in a public bathroom. When we first got to Clallam Bay, we lived in the mansion. Before long, we sold it and rented a big double wide in a trailer park on a bluff looking down on the ocean. This was the kind of trailer that actually needs some furniture. It wasn't all built in. Sometimes when Mom wanted to make dinner in peace or go to the laundromat alone, Lloyd would say, "You kids want to go on a wander?" He meant a walk on the beach. There was never a time we didn't want to go. I could have a bellyache and a fever and I'd still go on a wander. We'd walk on that beach with Lloyd as long as he'd let us, no matter how cold our faces or fierce the wind. I had a powder blue pea coat with polyester white fur lining that I thought was so pretty, though it had belonged to another girl before me. It wasn't even a little bit water resistant, but I didn't care. You know how sometimes you're listening to a song you love and all you can think about is restarting the same song as soon as it's over? That's what it was like to walk on the beach with my dad. Lloyd stopped often to stoop down and point things out along the shore. He'd gather seashells or bits of interesting flotsam. Not just gather, consider. He might hold up a piece of broken shell and ask, "What's that look like to you, hun?" He was truly interested in my interpretation. He'd asked if I could imagine if it was as the head, foot, or body of one of his seashell creatures. He used a hot glue gun to put together shells and create silly figures, some on 2 legs, some on 4, 6, or 8. He'd add plastic googly eyes and then take them down to a tourist shop and sell them. Our beach walks were collecting missions to gather shells, driftwood, moss, and rocks for his critters. But it was about more than collecting. Lloyd would hold up a piece of driftwood and ask us to look at the way the sea had shaped it. We discovered mermaids, dragons, wiener dogs. Driftwood can be anything, and Lloyd never got tired of that idea. It's just plain wood, but also a tadpole, a giant's pointer finger, a long, skinny Ford pickup truck. He taught us to compare today's landscape with yesterday's, to observe the way the ocean kept on changing the lines of our walking. Nothing stronger than the power of the sea. Nothing's got more slow patience, not the coastline with its craggy bluffs, not the mountains or the rivers or even the forest. I lived in a small body then, and when Lloyd knelt down to talk to me, to show me the miracle of an unbroken sand dollar or newly forming inlet, he looked like a man at prayer. What I mean to say is that he made me feel like I deserved to take up space. From his moments of careful attention, I learned to expect some amount of worship from the world. From his violence, desperate apologies, and absences, I would discover that the same sparkling fires that fueled his creativity could burn out of control, leaving a landscape stripped of life. Lloyd would hurt and fail me in 100 ways, but first he taught me to wonder, gave me love without condition, and moments where I felt holy.
Thank you, Tina, for sharing that. So tonight, the three of us are just going to be asking you questions, and I'll start things off, and James and Ariana just jump on in whenever. But kind of, as you mentioned, this book largely focuses on the time spent with your dad, and your early childhood, I'd say, makes up the bulk of it. So temporally speaking, we're pretty removed from all that, and I'm curious what compelled you to write this now?
Good question, Lane. I think that, I mean, in a way, I've always been writing it, right? Like, I think before I started writing it, it was like written in my body, like I was carrying it. Um, and I definitely, like, as you mentioned earlier, you know, I finished college while raising my kids, which means it took me like 15 years. Like I would take like a class at a time and, or two classes or whatever. And always around my kids' schedules. And so I was always taking writing classes, and, you know, sometimes I just had to write stuff. And these just like, these stories were the ones that kept coming out, and that like instructors would always be like, this needs to be a book, but that I would be like, no, I'm putting those away. I only write them when I have to, like if I'm in a nonfiction class or something. But I've got to say, those weren't just Lloyd's stories. There are a lot of stories about, it was a hard upbringing with my mom as well. And there was a lot, but I think I think part of the reason that I decided to make this the story now, a big part of the reason is that I have an adult sibling who still very much struggles in poverty and a lot of the illnesses that come along with that. And she has two girls. And her oldest, my niece, who's precious to me, they're both precious to me, she was definitely coming, you know, she was entering like the late middle school, teenage years. And I saw the way she was carrying the shame of her family situation with her. And like it was like this instant thing that one day I drove her to school and dropped her off. And I remember watching her get out of the car and walk into school and just thinking, she's carrying so much with her into that school that the other kids and the teachers just have no idea, right? Like what it has taken for her to just walk in that school today. And it was definitely what really pushed me, was like, she needs to see stories where she gets to be proud of her family, where it's like, because in this country we shame the poor, like we make people feel bad just for being poor. Like it doesn't really matter what they do, it's just bad to be poor. And so I that was a huge reason why. And of course, if you're writing nonfiction, it's easier to write it about somebody who's dead. So of all the stories I could write, this one was the one to start with.
I'm going to piggyback off of that. So you're telling the story, and anytime you tell a story, you have to choose what goes in and what doesn't make the cut. And you talk about a lot of hard and painful things, but you also talk with such beauty and joy about everything. But we know that still you have to leave things out. Are there stories that you wanted to include that didn't make the final cut? And could you maybe talk about your process for deciding what belonged in this book and what didn't?
Yeah, you bet. I think so the book, I've cut at least 300 pages, and it's funny because this is like the first event I've had like since I've started to get feedback from readers, because the book really became very available. Like it was kind of late, so people were really getting their hands on it last week. And I've been getting a lot of messages and emails and stuff. And I just lost my train of thought, but tell me your question again, Ariana. I just lost my train of thought. Talk about what I cut out. That's it. Yeah.
That's it. Yeah.
So what a lot of people are telling me in these emails is that they sat down and read it in like a night. Like I've had like 10 people tell me that. And it's so funny because I studied so many books when I was writing it. And I don't know if you guys know this, but I used to fancy myself a fiction writer, and I wrote bad fiction. And so I had decided to write nonfiction because I thought, you know, it's going to be even, first of all, I was always writing these fiction stories. Like, I think I was trying to be like the next Alice Munro, only a little more hip. And so I was always writing these fiction stories about women who were like my age and had like a similar marriage and similar age children, but had parents who, like, you know, sent them to college and had season tickets to things, you know what I mean? And just so it came across, I think, as very fake. But when I went to write nonfiction, I was like, oh, I really want to write it like a novel. Like, I want to use all the tools of fiction. It needs to be readable like a novel. It needs to say something about the wider world like a novel, you know, and like, I just felt like it needed to read like fiction. But I also noticed that, because I'd never been a big memoir reader, that a lot of memoirs that I started reading sort of study this form just had too much in them sometimes. Like sometimes I just felt like, okay, did we need all of this? And I think this might come a little bit from being a bookseller. Like I'm super, super conscious of the reader's time. And so I cut so much. I decided somewhere along the line that most of the memoirs that I was really digging were about 250 pages. 200 to 250 pages. So I was like, I'm going to land at 250. This is not going to be a 300-page memoir, but it was like a 400-page memoir. So I just kept cutting stuff and cutting stuff. And so I finally made the decision to stop the book when Lloyd dies. And so that helped cut a lot. But what I sometimes sort of regret having lost in that cut is that there were a couple of stories. I talk in the book about how I realized that I carried a lot of that I'm susceptible to the same sort of senseless anger that my dad would slip into sometimes. And there were a couple of stories about me as like a young adult that I thought were really good at showing that. And I'm a firm believer in, if you are going to write nonfiction, you have to be willing to be, the asshole sometimes. You can't be like this perfect person and everybody's always beating you down and you're perfect and the world's horrible. And so I had a couple of stories in there. One was about parenting, was a time that I was parenting my son and I shamed him. And it reminded me of, I don't know if you remember the pudding story that Lloyd, and there were a couple stories in there about me exposing my Lloyd-like qualities that just didn't work once I decided to end the book at his funeral. So sometimes I kind of wish there was a way to keep them. And I tried really hard and I had people that I was bouncing it off and they were just I just can't, it just doesn't work, So.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because one of the things I kept thinking when I finished the book was, well, when you do the next one, I want to hear about you parenting.
Yeah.
This is so good at describing how the traits that you picked up from both of your parents. I mean, primarily Lloyd, since he's kind of the main focus of this, but also your mom. And I'm like, well, and how is that playing out now for you?
Yeah.
The sort of Dr. Phil thing.
Yeah. And that might have been a little hard because I didn't have enough distance from that yet to see myself critically, but definitely it's coming. I have a whole list of projects.
Good. The question I was going to ask, you alluded to there, what are some of these books that influenced you? I had several in mind as I read, because that's what I always do. It's the easiest thing to do rather than have original thought, is just go, hey, this is like this book and this is like that book and all that. But what were yours? I'm
kind of curious to know what yours were, but I will tell you what they were because it's a very definitive list. So I read, I think 40 to 45 memoirs as I was kind of writing it and gearing up to writing it. But I also studied a lot of poetry and fiction. But I would say the biggest, because I was always just dissecting them and thinking, what would I take from this? And I think some of the big ones were definitely Maya Angelou. I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. She's just the best at writing the way that we feel responsible for our abuse as children. There's nobody that has done it as good as she has, and nobody ever will. And also Toni Morrison, because I was looking for, I was kind of researching how best to write, to make the environment kind of a character. And Toni Morrison is so good at that. In Sula, I don't know if you know Sula, but they live in this community called The Bottom, and The Bottom is like a character in the book. And I remember reading that and being like, okay, this is kind of what I'm going for, for our surroundings to be a sort of living, breathing part of the story. And then Mark Doty has a memoir called Firebird that was a really big one for me because he writes memoir like an essayist. So he doesn't just go through scenes, but he's always kind of reflecting back and sort of wondering the way an essayist does. Do you know what I mean? To me, the best essays, my favorite essays, don't answer questions. They just sort of ask them and sort of wander around in them. And I feel like that's what he does in that book. It's an older memoir. I don't think it's super popular, but it was definitely an influence for me. And then Maxine Hong Kingston, the woman warrior. And because, she'll imagine she'll tell an imagined thing as if it's real. And I knew I wanted like this sort of fairy tale theme in the book, because that's what it was like for me. Like I was kind of in this fantasy land the whole time I was with Lloyd. We were always living in the forest, sometimes in shacks he built or a tent, or, you know, we never really had regular normal housing. And, but I always imagined myself being in this kind of center of this fairy tale. And so, so that was something I took from Kingston. Dorothy Allison, of course, Trash is a big one. And then Rebecca Solnit has a, I guess you'd call it a memoir called The Faraway Nearby. And that one was big for me because I had this idea. I wanted to sort of steal the labyrinth structure. I don't know if you're familiar with that book, but and that too is definitely written like an essay. It's like a braided lyric essay, but book length. I love that book. It's amazing. But she plays with the structure of the labyrinth in that book. And so she sort of weaves her different themes in a very interesting way. I don't know if you've read it, but I wish I could show it to you, but basically she has the whole book, and then across the bottom of the book, like there's a line that's its own separate essay that runs through the entire book. And then when you look at the title of contents, there's the number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then it meets in the middle at like 6, and then goes back down, and 1 and 13 have the same title, and 2 and 12. So she's kind of playing with this labyrinth structure. And I was like, well, I know for sure I want this book to be very simple and approachable, but I'm still kind of thinking about that. So that's kind of why like the Packwood scene is at the very heart of the book, because I wanted like that to be like the thing trapped at the center. And, but I wanted to do all that and make it seem super simple and like nobody thought about it at all.
I want to take your writing class now.
Were any of those things you guessed?
Dorothy Allison was, that I thought, I mean, and as you described them, they make perfect sense. Rebecca Solnit is kind of a patron saint for me at my bookstore. But I haven't read all those, but now I want to, so that's great. I was thinking a little bit of This Boy's Life, which is like, you know, another sort of Northwest classic, but which is a really good book, but very much of a different generation. Like you have introduced all kinds of things that he probably didn't think about from his position, which is what I like. You know, it's a woman's voice, and it's a voice of someone who's, you know, talking about class and talking about general issues rather than just the personal ones.
Yeah.
So I really like that.
Do you know there's another one by Harry Crews that's I can't think of what it's called. I think it's just called A Childhood. Yeah. Do you know this book? Super
I've heard
good.
of that. I have not read that one
Super
either.
good. And he does the thing where he imagines things he couldn't say for sure, because that was something I was dealing with right out of the gate. Is like, how am I going to tell the truth? There's so many things you can't know for sure. I have to just admit when I don't know them for sure.
So I'm glad that that came up, because that was very much related to a question that I had. And you do really, like, right out of the gate talk about the idea of memory being either imperfect or just absent, or very much shaped by the stories that Lloyd would tell. And it kind of created this like a family mythology. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that, the idea just of the creation of this family mythology, and also kind of as like a secondary part of that, if in the process of writing this book, you found yourself searching more for like an objective truth that you were trying to find or put down on paper, or if you found yourself kind of like solidifying these myths and finding deeper truth through these familial myths.
Yeah, I will say that I think when I started it, I was really concerned with truth and veracity. And when I finished it, I was less so. I know that's weird. I was actually just, I read Billy Ray Belcourt's book a long time ago when the ARC first came out, but just the other day I was on a walk and listening to him read it. And for some reason I was grabbing things I had missed before. And he says something in there about how, about his fidelity being more to like the way that this lays on the page versus veracity. And I think I came to that place. Nothing's made up and nothing's untrue. I mean, this is me sort of saying two opposing things at the same time, because I definitely, like there was something that my mom and my brother read early drafts because I wasn't going to even consider publishing if they weren't okay with it, those two people. And my mom, there was like a really big detail that I was like 100% wrong on. Because what I had done is I remembered a very similar, I mean, my dad was prone to violence. There were a lot of violent episodes that I witnessed. So I was trying to describe one particular violent episode and something that I knew had absolutely happened during a violent episode, but I got it totally wrong. And so I definitely like went back and rewrote that. If I knew something was absolutely wrong, definitely fixed it. But at the same time, I was trying to I wanted to tell the stories as Lloyd's daughter. Like the voice in that book is probably more the voice of Lloyd's daughter than the voice of me, because it's like I took a little of my mom out. And to me, there was this idea that if he were alive, I would want it to be approachable to him, especially at the beginning, at least when that's all that child knows. And so that sort of myth making is an important part of the way he would tell a story. And so definitely at the beginning, the language is there. It's like my dad is this kind of, and that's how I saw him, this kind of amazing mythic figure. And, but then as I grow older, I have, the storytelling clashes with what I'm witnessing in my life. And I'm coming to the place where what I thought I knew and what I see with my own eyes, the stories I've been told, because my dad would like retell stories and sort of tweak them just a little to try to make it fun. He was always turning things funny when I found them. I would think back and be like, but that was scary. It wasn't funny, And so there comes a point where you're out in the world, you're getting an education, you're reading books, and you're getting older and separating from your parents. We all do it. Where I started to really kind of question his myth making. I don't know if I answered your question, but I talked about myths.
No, that was great. And we do have a question from Curtis in the audience. I know that you are a writing instructor and are especially interested in helping marginalized voices. In your experience, what are the challenges of coaxing self-expression from people who have not expressed themselves before?
I don't coax it at all. If somebody isn't ready to tell their story, that's totally okay. But it just falls out. Like, I teach creative writing, and those are usually people who are coming because they want to tell that story. They want to write a book, or they want to write a, essay or whatever. But I also teach comp classes, and I really like to teach writing 90, which is like for students who are trying to enter the college space and have probably faced some barriers. They're not quite at college level writing yet, and that's my favorite. And it's so cool because I'm just now getting to this place where students who I had in writing 90 and have made their way through 115 and 121 are signing up for creative writing to write their stories, which is so amazing. But I let them write in comp classes. I let them write about, I have them write like a personal narrative and blah, blah, blah. But I'm like, it can be a funny thing your dog did, or it can be whatever. And the stories just fall out. Like if they're ready to tell them, they just start coming out. But I certainly don't push anybody to tell. And with my creative writing classes, I'm always like, if this isn't therapy, right? There's a difference between, I just read this really great Melissa Febos essay about writing about trauma. It was really good. And it kind of about how there's this kind of haughty judgment among the literati toward memoir. And like it's women's work. And so it's not literary, and women are always writing about their trauma and stuff. It's really good. It's called The Heart Work of Trauma. And she's like, it's really hard because you have to face all your own kind of bullshit, but you also have to employ all the tools, that you use in making anything. Like, this isn't my life. This is a made thing. This is a thing that I made and put together. It's not my life. Did that answer your question? Did I answer your question, Curtis?
Well, I'm sure we'll hear from him if it didn't. But I think that goes nicely into something, you and I have talked actually a lot because, we serve together on this board and we're friends and have spent a lot of time together. We've talked about issues of class and issues of growing up rural and poor and far from the center of academia and the literary world and everything. And there's a lot of challenges that non-establishment readers and writers face. And there's this idea of imposter syndrome. It comes up with folks who feel like they don't belong in a life of literature and the mind. Can you talk about your experience being someone who long didn't feel they belonged in the literary world?
Sure. So yeah, your question makes me think of, you guys remember that Jackie Diaz book, Ordinary Girls, that came out a couple years ago? Curtis, I think that was one of your books. It was a Algonquin title. I love that book. And I remember I nominated it for the Indie Next list. And I remember writing something in that nomination about how when you grow up poor, you feel like your voice is ugly and there's something wrong with your family. And if you're going to tell your story, the only way that's invited in literary circles or in academia is if you sort of make a spectacle of your family. And so what I loved about her book was that, she tells the truth. She doesn't hide like the flaws in her family, but there's also just a lot of beauty and love there. And I think when I was younger, I was much more afraid to speak up. Like, you spend so much time trying to hide the fact that you're poor. Like, that's the whole point. It's all you think about all the time. Not let them see your free and reduced lunch ticket, like you're just constantly trying to act like you are not like you. And it's funny because, and that's kind of what I tried to show with like the way I set up the world at the beginning of Rough House, like that passage I just read about the trailer. Like, I thought the trailer was awesome. Like, the world of that little trailer was beautiful to me. And it was never my family that told me to be ashamed of being poor. It was the outside world. So on top of whatever problems faced us, because yes, absolutely, when you are poor, you face a lot of challenges. But on top of that, there's just this kind of shame that the world dumps on you. And so I think what the answer to your question is that I got more educated and more financially secure. And the further I got from poverty, the more comfortable I was setting that shame down and talking about it. And again, a big catalyst was my family, my nieces, my people who you really have to leave. Like, you have to leave them all. Like, that's the only way. And it sucks and it's not right. And so I think part of me is just raging against assimilation and the idea that like I have to leave behind everything that had to do with that life in order to have health insurance and a mortgage and a college degree, so I'm pushing back. I think I'm just kind of pushing back against that. And that's probably how I don't think I directly answered your question either, Ariana. But
that's okay.
That's what it felt like for me.
No, it's amazing because your book spoke to me. So on such a personal level, it's a powerful, beautiful book.
Thank you.
So, thank you.
I was going to say that, one of the things that really struck me about it in an unexpected way when I read it was how appealing so much of it was. It would be really easy to have written Lloyd as a villain, and your situation as traumatic, which it was at times, but the fun parts come through. And I was struck. I had a very stable childhood. We were not well off, but we did not want for the important things in life. And I realized looking back, we moved once. We moved from Illinois to Arizona, and that was a monumental thing. Like, that was almost overwhelming and like a big epic event in family history. And I find myself envying, someone who's been through this, so many changes and so many moves. Like, I feel unprepared as an adult in many ways because I didn't go through these things younger. Mm-hmm. And it's actually hard to, it makes me want to be safer and all that. So, I guess I just was asking you, like, what's that like you, what benefits do you find from having been brought up that way?
Well, there's definitely benefits. It's funny, I was just walking, I have one really good friend here in town who grew up very similarly to me. And she's always been someone who will just kind of like, if I'm hitting a wall or something, she'll just be like, it's okay, you can do this. And we were walking today and we were talking about something that happened to her at work. And I'm like, oh, those people who weren't raised poor, they just can't handle anything. It was this really funny interaction between us, because I do think you learn to just like really roll with the punches and just sort of like, even anything I have to face, I'm like, can this be any worse than what Lloyd did there or what Lloyd did there? You know what I mean? But when you move all the time, you have to constantly figure out how to talk to new people. What's weird about us moving so much is that I always migrated when I was with my dad. And when my mom left him, she stayed in one place for the whole rest of my childhood because she wanted to give us stability. So we were in the same town, but I still ended up going to 8 different schools in that one town because we were poor. And so when you couldn't pay rent and you got evicted and you had to move to a new apartment or whatever, you'd be in a different school district. And so like those were all just from moves within the same town. So I mean, I definitely wouldn't, for me, I wouldn't recommend, like I would have loved to stay in one place. One thing that's hard about writing a book after being so mobile is it can be really hard to like put a setting to a memory, because when I was with my dad, we were always in a forest. We were almost always near a mill or, a timber operation. But those are easy to interchange. It's dirt roads. It's some sort of like camping trailer park or very small neighborhood in a rural town. And it can be hard to tell. Even my mom, like I had her read this. I'm like, can you help me place all these things in time? And she's like, that sounds exactly like if I were remembering it, that's how I would remember it, but I can't tell you what town that was. And so that's a little hard. And I think there's, probably a little attachment disorder that happens, like all the kids whose names you don't remember, and adults, like we were constantly being told to call adults our aunt and uncle who weren't our aunt and uncle. And then they would just disappear and we'd never see them again, So, but I do think that there's definitely a lot of skill that comes from it. And I think I'm very adaptable.
We have seen that on the board. I'll just throw that out there.
Yeah, this is true. Kind of related to that, and I get this is sort of like a half-baked question, but this story it's very much set in place, and I think that it being related to the logging industry kind of lends itself to that nomadicism a little bit. I don't know if nomadicism is a word,
Makes sense.
but obviously you deal with the themes of class and poverty. And I was wondering if you had thoughts about, or even in your process of writing it, where you wanted that to be both, I think you did a really good job of balancing the universality of those challenges that people in the South or in Appalachia would face, but also in its own specific, like sort of Pacific Northwest version of it. And I was wondering if you had any just thoughts on that.
Thoughts on, can you ask?
Your process, did you intentionally try to make it
Okay.
accessible in that way or relatable?
Or grounded in the Northwest, or just trying to spoon feed like?
Either one.
I mean, I think I definitely want it there. I think that the kind of life my dad had is fairly common in rural Oregon and Washington and Idaho and Alaska. I have a friend who was born in Klamath Falls, and she was just like, people don't realize that people still live like this all over in little, kind of drained timber towns. And and I think that we like to imagine people might like, when I remember the first time I wrote about the way my dad lived and it was set in Idaho, and somebody who read it thought he was like a separatist. Like, who's the guy that got gunned down at Ruby Ridge? Like that guy, right? And I was like, oh, no. He wasn't thinking about his choices like that. Like he was a person who had warrants out for his arrest. Like this is what it's like for a lot of poor families. Like you do something, right? but you become known for the worst thing you ever do. And so then it's like, okay, you have a warrant out, and then you can't go to the DMV and renew your license because you're afraid you'll get arrested. So then you're driving without a driver's license. And then it's like, well, you can't get car insurance because you're driving without a driver's license. You can't renew your tags. So you're just full on driving illegally. And you can't really get approved for a decent rental anywhere because you don't have steady income. And so for him, it was just easier to live in the woods, and just sort of build a shack or put up a tent, or, often he would repurpose abandoned trailers and clean them up and live in them. And I think it's a way that many people are living right now. Like, it's not babies are born and come home to trailers like this. And that's where they have Christmas, and that's where they learn to walk, and that's where they have all their joys and sorrows, and that's their home, So yeah, I think I definitely was trying to be like, hey, these are real lives and they matter.
Yeah, and I think it's the type of poverty, and this is so specific to the Northwest, like living in North Carolina and just reading Southern literature, the poverty that you see in Appalachia is often the opposite, where it's very much rooted in families never move at all. And that's part of why, the cycle perpetuates.
You read Sarah Smarsh, Heartland. I love that book. But that's Kansas, but same deal, where her family, they own their land, which to me at first I was reading it and I'm like, you're not poor, you own land. We never owned anything. But then it's like, yes, they've owned this land, but it's almost useless, and bits of it have been taken away, and they stay there because that's their land, but they're barely making it. So I know what you mean. It's different in different regions.
And I'm glad you held up the cover of the book, because we have a question about that very thing from the audience. If you know who designed the cover of the book, and the person from the audience mentions that she loves the sun being also the core of the tree, which I also really like as well.
Awesome, thank you. So that is a designer named Kirk. So, and I've never met Erin in person, but I definitely sent her a bunch of images and then, or sent them to Marty at OSU, and then she just kind of worked from there. And it's funny because at first I got sort of comps that sort of look like this, and then I got this totally different version where it was a white background with a trailer that was cool, but it was almost too hip, almost like a glam camping, and there were all these purples and stuff. It looked like maybe a YA novel, an apocalyptic YA novel. It was so interesting, these two different interpretations of what might work. And I think it's because I had said to her, I'm worried about the cover being super drab, because it's oh, it's another sad memoir where nothing happy ever happens. And I feel like I'm constantly trying to tell people it's joyful, there's a lot of joy and magic. And yeah, so, and it was funny because when she first sent it to me, I didn't know, I noticed the rings, but I didn't notice that this is the Oregon-Washington border.
Oh.
Yeah, which is pretty cool. It took me a minute, and then I'm like, wait a minute, isn't that the Columbia River? I was like, I recognize that line. And then this trailer, so we had a whole bunch of different options. And when this one came through, I was like, ooh, even though I was like, do I want brown? Where's all the cheer, right? But I saw that trailer and I sent it to my brother, and he was like, oh my God, I think we lived in that trailer. And so he was like, if Dad saw that, he would be like, kids, we're home. And so we decided that was the right trailer for the cover.
Speaking of trailers, there's so many good photos in the video book trailer, which we were talking about earlier. We were all agreeing that the idea of book trailers is kind of silly, and generally they're not all that interesting, but the one that they've made for your book is actually quite good. You're speaking in it, and you get to see a lot of the stuff that's talked about in the book, and really quite good. So, and yeah, and when you look at the cover, you would kind of assume, well, this was a family photo, wasn't it? But no.
Yeah, people are always asking to see more photos of my family, and I'm like, go look at the book trailer. I intentionally withheld photos in the book because all I really wanted were those 3 letters from Lloyd. And I read the same. It goes back to the idea of writing it like fiction. I like to imagine the people and stuff. So I didn't want to fill it with family photos. I reluctantly sent them the one photo that's in the back, but I did really want a couple of his letters because it really shows like what Lloyd's literacy level was like, and also that his emotional intelligence was sort of, I mean, he kind of, I used to informally call these the sad daddy letters. Like I have a big box full of them, and there's always this kind of sadness. And then there's also, you can see like when he was sober, the letters like really tidy and happy. And then when he's using, it's like his handwriting scrawled across the page and the letters are really big. And so I just thought the letters were a really great way to represent him.
Well, will you talk a little bit more about Lloyd? I mean, he is a central figure in this book, and so many people would have just portrayed all the trauma and everything, but I love how you make him a redeemable character and you don't let us just hate him all through the book. And that I think speaks so much to your character, but also to, your ability to see and think deeply and to love deeply. And I don't know, can you tell us a little bit?
Yeah, I start the book with this. It says something about him what does it say? I should have it memorized. You might not consider my dad a good man. And that's just because I think I'm thinking about that idea of assimilation, the idea that not everybody's given the same opportunities. And this idea of who is a good person is really interesting to me because, one thing I've discovered being in the middle class, being financially secure, especially as I raised children and as they went to school and you meet a lot of families and stuff, you begin to notice that like people here do a lot of the same stuff, like a lot of the same misfortune comes their way as far as particularly in terms of like addiction and unhappy marriages and not always treating people like they should, but it does not rule their lives in the same way. And the idea that Lloyd might not be a good man to me is what I'm setting out to explore, because I just think it's, like I said before, and I think I stole that from Just Mercy. It's really easy when you're poor to become known for the worst thing you've ever done. And I think when I probably first started writing these stories in my 20s or whatever, I probably would have written him as just a straight up bad guy, because there was a lot of this I hadn't processed or dealt with yet. But the older I get, the more I realize how much he gave me and how much I got from him, and how much of the shame he was carrying shaped who he was, and his lack of education and the generations behind him of hardship. And so I don't think it would be telling the truth either to not show that, because we loved him. He was awesome. He was fun. There's a reason my mom went back to him several times before leaving him for good. Like he was a very magnetic personality, and he just he had a singular way of loving us and a way of paying attention that I've rarely seen. And so that went a long way. I think it, like I said in that passage before, like he made me feel holy. And so that has saved me a lot in my life. So I don't think I would have been better off without him.
Well, and talk about his wishing that he had had more education. And we have a question from the audience from Shelley, who asks, who inspired you to pursue higher education?
Definitely my mom was always like, people aren't supposed to live this way, Tina. You need to go to college. Moms aren't supposed to raise kids alone. You want to go to college. You want to not have kids unless you have somebody to help you raise them. And she was just, and it was funny because she was always pushing me to go to college, in particular me, because I was the best student in the house. And, but she didn't know how to actually help me do that. Like there was never a person who sat down and helped me with my homework, right? There was never a person who asked if my homework was done or knew if I had homework. There was rarely, if at all, a person in an audience at a school play or something, right? Like my mom worked all the time. And And so she was always telling me I needed to go to college, but nobody was showing me how to do that. And I remember going to my high school counselor and being like, I want to go to college. How do I do that? And he was like, oh, community college is probably good for you. Like, he pretty much handed me a pamphlet for the local community college, because I just couldn't understand like the paperwork part of it. I was like, I have a decent GPA. Like, I want to do this. And I just couldn't figure out how to get there. And so, and I also, when I was, there was a lot of pain on both sides of my family. So when I was graduated high school, I was actually on my own. I lived in an apartment and I was on my own. And so I just didn't have any money, and I couldn't file a FAFSA. I tried to file a FAFSA, and both my parents had, you know, my dad hadn't filed taxes in, if ever, I don't know. And they wouldn't let me file a FAFSA without my parents' taxes and stuff. So I just kind of took a community college class at a time and just sort of paid for it as I could. And sometimes I couldn't, because sometimes I had to work all the time to pay rent. And then once I married, you know, we were able to help each other go to school because we could share financial resources. And then once my kids were both in school, I really buckled down and like went and just did 2 years straight to finish my bachelor's, and then took a bunch of time off, because then it was time to like pay for my kids' stuff and pay for a kid to go to college and all of that stuff, and then take my turn, you know. So it was definitely a long journey, but I'm always amazed at people who, when I read other people's books who grew up in similar hardship, who just went to college. Like, I was reading the Sarah Smarsh book we just talked about, and I'm like, how did she get there? Because I remember just being like, I have no idea how to do this. And even like working up the nerve to ask that guy, and he just did not help me do it. You know, like, I just couldn't figure out how to do it.
I think she had a high school teacher who was a mentor, if I remember right. There was someone who, yeah. Because no one else in her family knew how.
Right.
And yeah.
I have a question, if we can bring it back kind of to Lloyd for a second. And you talked about his dual nature, which is obviously really present in the story. And I had a parent pass away a couple years ago, and she had anger issues, but nothing on that level at all. But in the time since she's passed, I have really struggled to remember the good things. I see them in photos and stuff, but the stuff that my brain defaults to is like all the bad things. And I'm really curious, because you present through your writing the good things about him so well, and that it's just not so simple. And I'm curious if that really came naturally through your writing, or if you had to be really deliberate about not veering too hard one way or the other.
I think those parts were the hardest to write. Okay. I think that a dramatic part where his behavior was really bad writes itself, right? I mean, it's all there, the drama and the, like, of course it took a lot of shaping and time, but those parts, the story was already there. But it was so much work, because it's quiet moments that are like the nourishing part of what we get from our parents. And so I think for any of us, those are hard to find, because they're kind of the mundane daily stuff. And so those were definitely the hardest parts to write. And I did go through a lot of photos, like you just said, and that would kind of help trigger memory, or talking to my brother or whatever. But I'll like, I always tell my students, you just got to sit down and write. Like, you just start writing, and then pretty soon you start like, I consider writing a process of discovery. And I found stuff I didn't remember just while I was writing, but it was definitely intentional, because I knew I needed that balance. I knew I needed those good parts. And so I had to work really hard to kind of find them. And then when I find them, just slow down, just really slow down and open up those moments, because that's what it feels like when you're in a moment like that in your life. But also that's why they're the ones that just really kind of nourish us, I think, those moments with our parents.
Yeah, you did such a good job, I think, saying the slowing down, because it would have been really easy to do, chapter with good Lloyd and then chapter with bad Lloyd and back and forth. And it would have been really jarring. Yeah. And it didn't feel that way. It felt really just natural.
Well, because the truth is, whether I like it or not, that was the same guy, right? The guy that did that is also the guy that did that. And so that was what I'm getting. I remember at one point at the beginning being like, okay, I've got this list of 12 awful things Lloyd did. Can I put all 12 of these in and still make him lovable? That's the challenge. And that was kind of where I started.
I have a sort of unrelated question to that, and we talked about this briefly a couple of days ago, but other members of your family and extended family, I guess, or now that the book is published, are starting to get their hands on it.
Yeah.
And I'm curious if you'd be willing to talk a little bit about what that's been like, either in general or specific terms.
I've definitely been a little worried about, there were 4 people that I was hoping would read the book before I made a decision whether or not to publish it. And I think you guys know this, and Curtis knows this because he's wonderful, but like, you know, I had some interest come my way before I really had even made any effort to try to see if this book was going to be published. And so I already had this idea that, oh, okay, there are folks interested in putting this in the world. Do I really want to? Now that I know that. And so, because, you know, I did write the book for my MFA thesis, or a version of it anyway. And so I would have had to write it regardless. And it's funny, you guys asked about book selling earlier. When I was at my MFA, I was always like kind of lecturing other students about, like, all they ever did was, they weren't there. A lot of people seemed like they were asking a lot about being published, not about writing. And I was like, just, you know, get to, like, just be a part of, like, it's an ecosystem. Go be a part of your community and like get to know your local bookstore and blah, 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 blah. You know, I remember having those conversations a lot. But anyway, tangent. So there were 4 people that I would have liked to have read the book before I ever made the choice whether or not to publish. And one was my mom, obviously. One was my brother. One was my stepmother, Linda, who's a huge character in the book. And then the other is my dad. My dad has one living sibling who's still alive. And my dad and his siblings were very, very close. He had a brother and a sister. And I wanted to give that sibling the opportunity, because I imagine it would be painful to read that if there were things they didn't know about him. And I was unable to reach that person, and I was unable to reach my stepmother. I tried to hunt Linda down. I've tried to stay in contact with her through the years, ever since Lloyd died, and we were pretty good for a while, and then she just sort of went off the radar again, which was pretty typical of them. I have since found out that Linda did pass away, and so I guess there's a little bit of release in that. But my mom and my brother read it, and they were both like, any part that I felt like was maybe I remembered slightly different or whatever, still felt like truth. Like, it just felt like what it was like. And it feels like it was just your experience of that day or whatever. And like, I even like badgered them to have me correct things. And they were, you know, there were just very few things they felt like needed any adjustment. So I've had their blessing the whole time. So that's great. But I have been worried about, like I said, my dad's sibling. And then also there's definitely a part in the book where I talk about abuse that goes on in my mom's family. And I have a lot of aunties on my mom's side, and they've been really supportive. They've all ordered the book and come to events and stuff. And they're a bunch of amazing women. But there is a way that we, in any family, not even if you're poor, when there are men behaving badly, there's a way that the women often keep those secrets for them. And I think the fact that I told those secrets, like, that scared me, made me worried. But my mom was like, Tina, you need to do it. This needs to happen. And I said, I'm tired of living in a world where it's the victims who have to be quiet all the time and who have to like not like protect the people that hurt them. And how will we ever get any better if we don't just like get it, you know, say what's true. And so I had all that in mind when I knew a lot of these women had a hold of the book. And I haven't heard from any of them yet, except one who is probably the person whose opinion I most would have worried about. And she was just like, definitely blessing, and she was like, I don't know if we can have a conversation about it yet. Like I'm processing some things, but I love it. I love that you wrote it. She was like, I feel like you're so brave. I don't know how you did that. And I was like, oh, you are far more brave than I am. But yeah, it's definitely been an anxiety. I'm kind of waiting to see, but my mom and brother were already out of the way. So that wasn't a fear at all.
We have another audience question from Avi. They ask, your inclination is to shine the light on those around you rather than talking about yourself. What has the process of writing a memoir and promoting it been like for you as an inherently private person?
I love this question for that.
Abby's my biggest fan who comes to all my events and my really, really, really dear friend. How dare you ask me that question in public, Avalon? It's really hard. I mean, I definitely wasn't raised to like take up a lot of space and be the center of attention. And also imposter syndrome, like you're constantly worried about that. And also it's a big, big fear that I would be seen as representing like an entire class of people and not just my particular family, because I just want to do right by the people in the story. So that makes me very anxious. And as Abby well knows, because she's not only my dear friend, but she's a therapist, I am a very anxious person. So it is not easy. And especially like Ronnie, who's probably on here as well, my husband, knows that I have to have like a little half glass of wine before every event. I'm just like, I'm so nervous and people are gonna be looking at me.
What has it been like differently releasing the book during the pandemic than what you might have expected? I mean, you as a bookseller, you know what book releases are like in non-pandemic times.
Well,
do you think it's been easier or harder?
At first I was like, of course, Tina, you're the kid that came home from the hospital in a cardboard box. So your book's going to be coming out when there are no book tours. No, but I was a little disappointed at first because like I was so looking forward to coming to all of your bookstores. But then I realized immediately after that thought, like, yeah, I was like looking forward to going to Country Bookshelf and seeing Ariana, but I was not looking forward to standing up in front of people. So the Zoom thing kind of works for me. Like, I kind of like that. Also, I feel like I got kind of lucky because Rough House landed at a time when not a lot of publishers were sending out ARCs. And so I think a lot of bookstores got an advanced reader copy when their reader copy piles weren't really high. And so maybe more people read it. And that has to do with why it's kind of chugging along now and doing pretty well for a little book. But you know, what's been cool is I get to do events with people that I would never get to do events with. Like, and like people, you know, we can be here together and we're all in different states. Like that's pretty cool. And I've been on events with authors who I wouldn't have been with otherwise.
Scheduling conflicts are much easier to get around when you don't have to involve travel in them.
Exactly. So, I mean, I feel like I'm pretty lucky. I'm weathering the pandemic pretty well compared to a lot of people. So I feel like I'm pretty lucky.
You're amazing.
Talk about the regional responses to this. I mean, the whole time I read it, I kept thinking it was a very Northwest book, which I would. But it's a wonderful book. Everyone, everywhere in the country should read it. Have you gotten responses from Appalachia and upstate New York?
I have not, and I don't know. Curtis would probably know better than I would about how it's doing over there. I did notice that, and I don't know how this happens, but Curtis showed me that that it was on the national indie bestsellers list, but on the bottom as like a indies love, like not in the ranked list. And I don't know how that happens, but I can't say I've had a little bit from like, you know, a couple like people in Chicago, but I haven't really heard a lot. No, I have no idea. That's a good question, James. I try not to think about it too much either. I don't want to worry too much about what it's doing. Like, it's out there. I will support whatever effort I'm asked, but I also don't want to like anxiously worry about it all the time.
So
Go ahead, Ariana.
Oh, I just I have the question. If So you have been doing a lot of these events and you've been asked a lot of questions. Is there any question that you haven't been asked yet that you wish someone would ask you?
That's a great question. I mean, I wouldn't say I can think of a particular question, except that I will say this hasn't happened tonight, but I often feel like I'm asked questions about like my life and not so much about writing. And I think when you write nonfiction, there's a tendency to like, it's funny how especially before the book came out, like I'd just be talking to somebody somewhere and my husband would always be like, oh, my wife's a writer, she wrote a book. And then people would be like, what's your book about? And I'd be like, oh, I wrote a book about my dad. And then like, before I could even get the next sentence out, it'd be like, oh, I should write a book. And I'm always like, yes, you absolutely should. You write it and I will read it. So I think it's not a question people don't ask, but people often think like the book is your life, but it's not. It's definitely a made thing. It was a lot of work, so I think sometimes people forget to just ask about like that process, the process of writing it versus what you lived through.
Absolutely.
That's actually what I always want to ask about and don't, because I feel like it's too inside baseball sometimes. Because I was like, even in the excerpt you read where I'm like, well, that's in present tense and that part's not. And how did you do that and why and all that? And I feel like I'm getting too into the weeds, but
Well, maybe it's good to get in the weeds, James. Don't you think? So wait, do you have an actual question in that? Did I miss it?
No, not really. Just
okay.
That I want to credit you. I like to talk about whenever I do book club things for the store, you often get people, or I do at least, maybe I'm just a bad book club host, talking about, oh, this made me think of my life or my mom or whatever, even in fiction, as though the story is real. And I'm always interested in like, well, why did the writer make the choice the writer did? And how is the story being told? And this effect you're seeing, you realize that that's a crafted, that's the part that interests me, that makes a book good or less good, rather than what it's about necessarily. So I see that in the book.
For sure. And it's funny because it's like, I don't know if Melissa Febos says in that essay that I referenced a minute ago about how she thinks it's harder than writing fiction or whatever. I won't say that. I don't know. I won't compare. I don't think I was particularly good at writing fiction, but I do think it's a ton of work and it's a ton of craft work. And everything is thought about. Like everything has a reason. Everything's a conscious choice. And for me, the biggest thing was that I'm writing this thing and now I'm going to go back and try to simplify it. Like I really wanted to try to sort of echo Lloyd's speech and simple language. And I just wanted it to be super approachable and sort of honor him in that way as well. And so I was kind of scrubbing myself. And again, it's that assimilation thing, like scrubbing myself of the academic language to try to, so it's funny because I think it seems really simple, but it was a lot of work.
I want to just read out something that Curtis mentioned in the chat in relation to like the book Across the Country. Says that he's being told that many Pacific Northwesterners are sharing the book because they feel that it reads so true and that readers want to share with others who are challenged to tell their own stories. And I definitely just want to echo that it just reads it. I mean, fun is not the word that you want to use for it, but there's a really good energy to it that normally I like memoirs. I enjoy myself, but I'm not like passing them out to people really. And I know some people feel differently, but this is definitely one that I'm going to be sharing. And it occurs to me now that that's a really good opportunity to say to everybody attending who, if you haven't bought the book yet, do so. It is really fantastic and worth it.
Thank you, guys.
That's one of the best books I read this year.
Oh, you're so sweet.
Yes. Very.
And I guess on that note, we can kind of start to wind things down. If anybody has anything to add, Ariana, I know you might book club related.
I dropped a link in the chat, the Country Bookshelf Book Club, which is virtual now, so anyone can join from anywhere. We'll be discussing Rough House for our January meeting. It's always the fourth Monday at 6 p.m. Mountain Time. So that will be January 25th. I put the link to our book club page in there. We don't yet have the sign up link for this particular event since it's still a few months out, but please join us for that.
And you guys, if I can I interrupt for just a minute? Because I want to tell you that I just noticed in the chat a message from a reader who I think meant to respond to everyone, but just responded to us, so people can't see it. But Curtis, somebody responded to your earlier message about readers who want to share with others who are challenged to tell their own stories. And I won't call you out by name, just in case you did mean to do that privately, but this is a reader I've been corresponding with. So I just wanted to give a shout out and say that this person is in that place that Curtis is sort of talking about, thinking about writing their own story, and felt a sense of permission. So that was like one of my favorite things to hear, for sure. And actually, I think that came from outside of the Northwest. Now that I think about it, James, I lied to you earlier.
Great.
Wow.
Well, James, do you have any last
No,
minute?
I just echo everything everyone else here says. I know, like, of course, every author event we do is our favorite, but not really. It's a fantastic book, and I'm so happy that we could all get together and do this. This is what has made this kind of thing is what has made these months of strangeness worthwhile. So, all you out there, you can share in that by buying and reading this book with us. So please do.
Thank you, James.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Thank you, Tina.
Thank you, Tina. Really, truly, this was really fun. And be sure to go check out the event calendar at booksincommonnw.com for all the other great events that will definitely be good, but maybe not as good as this one.
You guys are the worst.
All right.
So long.
Bye.